Hey everybody, Rob Maurer here, and today we are talking about a big spike in commodity prices, especially for nickel. We've also got updates on FSD from Elon Musk, more news on Giga Berlin and Texas, an update on a battery factory from GM, and a couple other things as well. All right, looking at the markets today, this will carry into our conversation about commodities in a second, but the Nasdaq down 3.6%, tough day for the Dow and the S&P as well. And then Tesla down 4% on the day to close at $804.58. So a little bit worse than the Nasdaq, but considering Tesla's high multiple, really not all that bad, and certainly a lot of other stocks performing worse today. Looking ahead at the rest of this week, a couple of things to keep an eye on, of course, in addition to Russia and Ukraine. We do have the China Passenger Car Association numbers for February. Those are likely to come out sometime earlier this week. We might get those before market open tomorrow, actually. I think we're likely to see some pretty decent numbers here, but remember a couple things to keep in mind. First, February just a short month, only 28 days, and then that is further impacted by Chinese New Year, likely a few down days for production there at the start of the month. So probably not a great catalyst for the stock or anything like that, but should be some good information for us to extrapolate out for the rest of the quarter. The other item then, which is Thursday, about an hour before market open, is the core CPI, Consumer Price Index report. That'll show inflation month over month and year over year, and those numbers are still likely to be quite high because inflation didn't really start creeping up until March last year. That is of course expected, but just in terms of the headlines that we will see, it's going to be a high number again. If it comes in significantly higher than expected, that'll influence the expectation for interest rate increases throughout the rest of the year. All right, so getting into the news then, a lot of today is really about commodities. A lot of volatility in those markets today, and a lot of that seemed to be kicked off by conversations about possible bans on Russian oil, potentially for the US and maybe some parts of Europe as well. Prices spiked this morning as the US seemed to be more interested in doing that, and then fell a little bit this afternoon as Germany kind of pushed back on that idea. Then we're seeing reports this afternoon that the United States is perhaps willing to move ahead on a ban of Russian oil without participation of European allies. Parts of Congress already working on legislation around this, so I'd expect this to be rapidly evolving and come with continued volatility. Of course, anything with oil, always a big deal, but that also creates further escalation fears, concerns on extended sanctions for other commodities, fears about how Russia may react. I mean, we saw today them talk about how they may be willing to cut natural gas supply to Germany via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, and of course that would follow the decision from Germany to suspend the project for Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So you've got heightened tensions around oil, you've got heightened tensions around natural gas, and then of course metals as well getting caught up in that too. Day one of this invasion, we talked about how this could potentially impact nickel supply, Russia being the third largest producer of nickel. And although as far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be much news in terms of possible impacts to nickel, there was an unprecedented price increase today with futures contracts for nickel peaking at more than 90% above the previous closing prices, with the 3-month contract now trading at above $50,000 per metric ton. That's up about 150% year to date. To put that in context, mining.com says that a Tesla vehicle on average uses around 45 kilograms of nickel. So the price difference per vehicle for nickel at $50,000 per metric ton versus nickel at $20,000 per metric ton like it was to start the year, that'd come out to about $1,400 of price difference just for Tesla's cost on that nickel. Now again, that's just for context. Tesla has long-term supply contracts, and we also know that not every vehicle that Tesla makes has a lot of nickel in it. Thankfully, we have lithium iron phosphate in the supply chain as well. But if prices were to persist around that level, eventually that's obviously going to come back to Tesla as well. So it is important to understand that context as we watch this evolve over time. So anyway, I'd be curious to hear people's thoughts on this because again, I'm not necessarily seeing a huge reason for why this would have such an outsized impact on nickel particularly today. And it's always interesting to better understand those market dynamics. All right, next up, we've got a couple of updates from Elon on FSD over the weekend. He tweeted out, quote, "Beta 10.12 probably releases Tuesday in US and Friday in Canada," end quote. Always nice to see those new versions, and I would imagine we'll probably see those release notes pop up either tonight or tomorrow. But then particularly for Canada, also exciting because I think this will be the first version that is publicly accessible. Probably more interesting though was Elon's other tweet on the topic. He responded to a tweet asking about when version 11 would be coming. Remember, that's the single stack version, and that'll convert over the highway code to FSD Beta code. Anyway, Elon saying that, quote, "We are almost at the point where interventions are so rare on city streets that we can turn our attention to applying the code to highways. No point in doing so until passing that threshold," end quote. So kind of a tricky one to interpret here. I think there's a generous interpretation and a not so generous interpretation. On the generous end, what you could say is that Elon is talking specifically about version 11, which he is testing in alpha, and maybe a few other Tesla team members as well. And in that case, he could be talking about interventions specifically on that alpha version becoming so rare that they're almost ready to start converting that over to highways as well. because he is specifically replying to version 11. I think that interpretation does make a little bit of sense, but it's also easily interpreted as Elon saying that in general, with FSD Beta, interventions are becoming so rare that they can start to look at doing that for highway. And this would be the non-generous interpretation, and I think would actually be relatively bad news, because at least for me, I think part of the hope for version 11 and single stack would be that taking the FSD Beta code over to highways would provide a significant improvement on highways. And although I know Tesla doesn't really have much interest in something like a level 3 situation, I was curious to see if that might bring them up to a level close to that. But then this tweet would kind of make it sound like that's not even really started yet. Now, on that side of the argument, it's a little bit tough to square, I think, because I think anyone testing FSD Beta understands that interventions aren't really so rare. Certainly in some circumstances they are, but on the aggregate, I don't think that is how I would classify it, and I doubt many others would either, albeit it is not the most quantifiable statement there from Elon. So my hope is that he's talking about version 11 internal testing. My intuition says that he's probably talking about FSD Beta as a whole. If interventions were so low on the alpha version, why would they not release that as a beta? I don't know. Ultimately, that makes me lean a little bit more towards the non-generous interpretation, which again, I don't really take that to be a positive sign. Ultimately though, Tesla's got way more information on that than I do or than we do. They can see the interventions per mile, how that's evolving over time. They can see the percent of total miles driven by FSD. If I were at Tesla, those are two of the most important metrics I'd be looking at, as well as a lot of different cross-sectioning of that data. That's going to give them a lot better feel for where things are at, the rate of progress, as well as the consistency of that rate of progress than what we can get externally. Anyway, this is another area where I'd be really curious to hear people's thoughts in the comments today on where you kind of fall on that interpretation spectrum of Elon's tweet. All right, next up, we've got a little bit more reporting on the water supply issue for Giga Berlin that we had talked about on Friday. We're going to look at two reports here from Automobilwoche and RBB, try to sort of marry up information here as it is still a little bit confusing. So Automobilwoche saying that, quote, the State Office for the Environment will explain to the Strasbourg-Egner Water Association, WSE, at short notice that the continued operation of the Eggersdorf Waterworks will be accepted until further notice at a rate of 2.518 million cubic meters per year. This corresponds to the water flow rate before a requested increase, which was the subject of the lawsuit by two environmental groups, end quote. So they say that operation will be accepted, but only at the rate of 2.5 million cubic meters before. If we look at this RBB article then, we can see that the requested increase was to go from 2.5 to 3.6 million cubic meters per year. So, as far as I can tell, while this is still pending, which remember it's pending because they need to redo a portion of the public participation process, they do not seem to me to have permission to operate at that higher rate. Again, as best as I understand though, that may not be final. So in this RBB article, they do say also that, quote, WSE boss Andre Baylor outlined to RBB one way in which the suspension of funding in Eggersdorf could be averted in the meantime. Accordingly, the State Environment Agency could issue a toleration and thus continue to enable funding until the agency has caught up on public participation. The presiding judge of the administrative court had also mentioned this possibility, end quote. What I'm not entirely clear on is if the Automobilwoche report is after that and kind of said that, oh, they can continue operating at that lower rate. The other uncertainty then is if that lower rate is still enough to provide Tesla enough water to at least get through the ramp up stage. Tesla should need quite a bit less water in the early stages, so this may not actually be a hindrance in the short term. Then the other wild card is that this ruling is able to be appealed, but because they did fall short on the public participation time, I'm not sure exactly what there really would be to be appealed. Anyway, the Automobilwoche report says that the Ministry of the Environment stated that the renewed public participation could take an estimated 4 months once the grounds for the judgment were available. So that is the best of my understanding right now. A lot of uncertainty still, and I think even for our native German commentators, there's still not a lot of clarity here. I'll continue to try to understand this better, but again, my hope is that it's just not overly impactful during the ramp up portion. Definitely takes a little bit of the excitement of that final approval away, but I think that'll return when Tesla holds that opening ceremony event. And we did see some bullish commentary on that over the weekend. Dan Ives, for his part, chiming in that it removes a major overhang that Tesla stock has had, noting that, quote, many on the street were doubting if Giga Berlin ever actually would open, end quote. Next, we've got an update on Giga Texas from Teslarati, and if you didn't read the headline carefully, it might have caused a little bit of concern because it's about a public hearing for Giga Texas, but importantly, this is just for the Giga Fest event at Giga Texas, not the factory itself. So nothing to worry about there, but for Giga Fest itself, that public hearing is set for March 22nd. All All right, last couple of things for today. First, an update from GM. They have announced in partnership with POSCO Chemical that they'll be working together under a previously announced joint venture with the governments of Canada and Quebec with the intent to build an estimated $400 million cathode production facility in Quebec. Although it is a joint venture, it is majority owned by POSCO, and as far as production targets, I don't see anything on that quite yet. Lastly then, in case you didn't happen to see it, Ukrainian President Zelensky did tweet about Elon this weekend saying, quote, "Talk to Elon Musk, I'm grateful to him for supporting Ukraine with words and deeds. Next week we will receive another batch of Starlink systems for destroyed cities, discussed possible space projects, but I'll talk about this after the war," end quote. So nice to see that appreciation for Elon and of course for SpaceX, which has been working hard to keep communication up on Starlink as well. Elon noted on Friday that SpaceX had reprioritized to cyber defense and overcoming signal jamming, and that would cause slight delays in Starship and Starlink version 2. So significant efforts here from SpaceX going beyond just shipping in some terminals. Another tweet from Elon overnight on Friday that they'd already released a software update that had helped with some of that signal jamming. All right, that is where we'll leave it for today then. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you're subscribed and signed up for notifications. You can also find me on Twitter at Tesla Podcast, and we'll see you tomorrow for the Tuesday, March 8th episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.